Before the first truth is spoken, a quiet request must be made. As these old words are unsealed, leave a mark of where you listen from, a city known or forgotten, and if this chronicle speaks to you, bind yourself to it by subscribing, so these tomes may be opened again. Now let us begin. In the earliest ages of realm space, before calendars, before kingdoms, before even the idea of history had settled into mortal thought, authority itself was written into existence. Not proclaimed, not conquered, but inscribed. The tablets of fate were not legend even then. They were structure made tangible, a framework that defined what a god was allowed to be and what it was forbidden to become. Every divine act, every portfolio, every limit was bound to them, not as a reward, but as a restraint. The gods did not create this order. They emerged within it. Canon sources are unambiguous on this point, though they are often misunderstood. Ao, the overgod of realm space, stood above the pantheons not as a ruler among rivals, but as the guarantor of balance. His authority did not stem from worship, nor from conquest, nor from mythic origin. It preceded all of those. When the tablets of fate were set down, they did not elevate the gods. They defined them. This distinction matters because from it flows the first and most enduring distortion in the history of Faerun. To mortals, the gods were presented as sovereign by nature, eternal, supreme. Their dominion over life, death, magic, and fate appeared intrinsic, as though divinity itself was proof of rightful rule. Temples reinforced this belief. Myths echoed it. Even divine avatars spoke as if their authority were self-evident. Yet the tablets told a different story, one far less flattering. Power was conditional. Portfolios were assignments. Obligation came before privilege. This was never hidden by Ao. It was simply not emphasized by the gods. In the Dawn Ages, when divine portfolios were still fluid and poorly understood by mortals, this discrepancy caused little friction. Worship was young. The gods were distant. Mortals lacked the language to question cosmic legitimacy. But among the gods themselves, the truth was always present. They knew their limits. They knew the tablets bound them. And they knew that without Ao's sanction, their existence as gods could be unmade or reshaped. Yet knowing a truth and living by it are not the same. As ages passed and worship deepened, a subtle shift occurred. Gods began to speak less of duty and more of dominion. Their roles were no longer framed as stewardship, but as entitlement. This was not accomplished through a single decree or divine counsel. There was no moment of open rebellion against Ao, no rewriting of the tablets in secret. Instead, the change lived in emphasis, in omission, in the stories told to mortals, and the silence kept about certain boundaries. The tablets of fate remained untouched. The narrative around them did not. By the time early human civilizations rose, most mortals understood the gods as rightful rulers of existence. The idea that divine power was borrowed, regulated, or revocable had faded into abstraction. Even among scholars and priests, this framing became rare. The gods did not correct it. Why would they? Worship thrived. Authority went unquestioned. Order appeared stable. But stability built on distortion does not last forever. The first lie written into Faerun was not a false glyph etched into cosmic stone. It was a belief allowed to grow, that the gods ruled because they were gods, rather than because they were permitted to. Everything that follows in the realms, every divine war, every mortal catastrophe tied to godly pride, traces back to this quiet inversion. The tablets still waited, and they remembered the truth. Once the distortion had taken root, It no longer needed to be defended openly. It sustained itself through tradition. Mortal belief hardened around divine narratives that emphasized inevitability, gods as the natural rulers of existence, as fixed stars in the cosmic order rather than actors bound to it. This belief did not arise from false scripture, but from selective memory. What was remembered became sacred. What was forgotten became dangerous. The earliest canonical creation accounts already show this fracture forming. In the myths preserved by priests of multiple pantheons, the gods speak as architects of reality, shaping Toril, the seas, the skies, and the laws that govern them. Yet these same sources quietly acknowledge constraints. The gods cannot act freely beyond their portfolios. They cannot destroy one another at will. They cannot rewrite reality without consequence. These limits are described as natural laws, not imposed ones, masking their true origin. Io's presence in these early myths is telling. He is not worshipped. He is rarely named. When he appears, it is not as a god among gods, but as a corrective force, silent, distant, absolute. His absence from temples was not an oversight. It reinforced the illusion that the gods beneath him were supreme, unanswerable, and self-governing. Mortals were never encouraged to think higher than the pantheon they could see. Among the gods, however, the truth remained operational. Portfolios could be gained, they could be lost, they could be transferred. This was not theoretical. It happened. Divine rank was fluid in the early ages, reshaped by conflict, alliance, and necessity. Such fluidity should have exposed the lie immediately. Instead, it was reframed as proof of divine dominance, victory rather than reassignment, conquest rather than compliance. The distinction mattered most in how gods treated mortals. If authority is inherent, then obedience is owed. If authority is conditional, then responsibility flows both ways. As the gods leaned into the first interpretation, their tolerance for mortal defiance thinned. Punishments grew harsher. Divine retribution became spectacle. Entire civilizations would later suffer not because they broke cosmic law, but because they challenged divine ego framed as destiny. This shift did not go unnoticed by all. Certain ancient powers, primordials, elder beings, and non-divine entities of immense age, never adopted the gods' version of events. Canon sources hint at their contempt, their refusal to kneel, their understanding that the gods were administrators, not creators of the system itself. These tensions would later erupt into wars that reshaped Toril, but even then, the lie held. The gods fought as rulers defending their realm, not as custodians preserving balance. Within the pantheons, the distortion produced fear. To admit the truth openly would invite comparison. If gods were stewards, then they could fail. If they could fail, they could be replaced. This understanding lingered in divine memory, like a wound that refused to heal. It explains the ferocity with which gods guarded their portfolios, the paranoia surrounding usurpation, and the disproportionate punishment reserved for mortals who came too close to divine thresholds. The lie was no longer merely tolerated. It had become protective. By this point in Faerun's early history, the tablets of fate were already functioning as a silent counterweight to divine self-image. They did not intervene. They did not correct belief. They simply remained, recording obligations the gods increasingly preferred not to acknowledge. The danger was not that the tablets would be destroyed. The danger was that the gods would forget why they existed at all. The tablets of fate were never meant to inspire reverence. They were not relics to be adored, nor commandments to be preached. In canon, their purpose is far colder and far more precise. They defined jurisdiction. They recorded obligation. They marked the boundaries beyond which even gods could not pass without consequence. To understand how deeply the first lie penetrated Faerûn, one must understand what the tablets were and what they were not. They did not grant godhood. This is the detail most often softened or ignored in later retellings. The tablets did not elevate mortals into gods, nor did they crown the divine as monarchs of existence. They codified an order that already stood above individual will. When a god held a portfolio, magic, death, war, storms, it was not possession in the mortal sense. It was assignment, a charge, a role that existed independently of the one who carried it. This truth is supported repeatedly across editions and sources, though rarely emphasized in one place. When portfolios change hands, the world does not collapse. Magic does not vanish when Mystra dies. Death does not cease when Mirkul falls. These forces persist because they are not born of the gods who govern them. The gods are conduits. The tablets ensure continuity. That continuity was the real threat. If mortals understood that gods were replaceable administrators of eternal functions, worship would change. Faith would become conditional. Devotion would turn evaluative. And for gods whose power depended on belief, that shift would be catastrophic. The lie, that gods ruled by inherent right, shielded them from scrutiny. Over time, even divine memory blurred. Later deities, those who rose after the earliest ages, inherited a system already distorted. They learned the rules, but not the original intent. To them, portfolios felt owned, not entrusted. Authority felt personal. The tablets became abstract, a distant mechanism rarely contemplated, invoked only in moments of crisis. This generational drift among gods is one of the most dangerous elements of the deception, because it was not enforced by malice but by habit. Jurgal stands apart in this regard. Long before most modern pantheons stabilized, Jurgal held dominion over death, murder, and the dead. Canon presents him not as a tyrant, but as an accountant of endings, detached, precise, weary. When he relinquished his portfolios to Bane, Bhaal, and Mirkul, it was not defeat, it was resignation. And in that act, something essential was revealed. A god could step aside. No rebellion followed. No cosmic collapse ensued. The tablets of fate did not protest. They adjusted. This moment should have shattered the lie permanently. If godhood were absolute, abdication would be impossible. If authority were inherent, it could not be transferred like a burden passed from one hand to another. Instead, the event was mythologized incorrectly. Mortals remembered ambition, betrayal, and power struggles. The deeper implication, that divinity was not permanent, that even ancient gods served at the pleasure of order, was buried beneath narrative convenience. The gods who benefited from this burial did not disturb it. Those who noticed said nothing. From this point forward, fear replaced confidence within the pantheons. If Jurgal could surrender eternity, others could lose it. If portfolios could be passed, they could be taken. The lie now served a second function. It did not merely preserve authority in the eyes of mortals. It stabilized divine psychology. Gods began to cling to the fiction of inherent rule because the alternative was existential insecurity. This fear shaped divine behavior in subtle but devastating ways. It explains why ascension myths were suppressed or sanitized, why mortal apotheosis became taboo, why gods reacted violently to attempts at transcendence, even when those attempts followed established cosmic mechanisms. The issue was never legality. It was precedent. The tablets of fate remained silent through all of this. They did not intervene when gods misrepresented their role. They did not punish distortion of belief. Their function was not enforcement through action, but enforcement through inevitability. When violated, consequences came. Not because the tablets were angry, but because order reasserts itself. The lie could persist, but it could not protect forever. By the height of the early divine age, the lie had become structural. It no longer lived only in myth or mortal misunderstanding. It had shaped how the gods interacted with one another. Pantheons did not form solely around cooperation or shared purpose, but around the defense of perceived sovereignty. Divine alliances hardened. Portfolios became territories. Encroachment was treated as theft, not imbalance. This framing altered the meaning of conflict. In canon, divine struggles are often described as wars of ideology, alignment, or survival. Yet beneath these explanations lies a quieter motive: preservation of authority as ownership. When gods fought over domains, war, death, magic, tyranny, they were not merely clashing over influence. They were defending the illusion that such power belonged to them by right, rather than by assignment. Every divine victory reinforced the lie. Every divine defeat threatened to expose it. The gods spoke increasingly in the language of rulership. Titles shifted. Lord, Lady, Master, and Queen replaced older, more neutral descriptors. These were not cosmetic changes. Language shaped belief, and belief shaped worship. Mortals no longer prayed to caretakers of cosmic functions. They knelt before monarchs of reality. This evolution was gradual enough to feel natural, yet profound enough to redefine the relationship between God and follower. Consequences followed. As gods embraced rulership, dissent became rebellion. Mortal cultures that questioned divine authority were not corrected. They were erased. Cities vanished. Empires fell. Canon records many such destructions as punishment for hubris, but the line between hubris and inquiry grew dangerously thin. To ask whether gods could be challenged was to threaten the narrative that sustained them. Within this environment, divine law became inconsistent. If gods were rulers, then their will was law. But the tablets of fate did not operate on will. They operated on balance. This mismatch produced fractures. Gods who acted outside their portfolios found themselves constrained in ways they did not publicly understand. Their failures were interpreted as betrayal by rivals or resistance by mortals, never as correction by a higher order. The lie prevented accurate diagnosis. This is why divine paranoia intensified. Gods began to fear one another not simply as competitors, but as potential usurpers. The possibility that power could be transferred legitimately through cosmic structure was intolerable. Thus, gods framed all attempts at ascension or redistribution as crimes against nature, even when canon demonstrates that such processes were once accepted under specific conditions. The myth of inherent divinity demanded absolute defense. Ironically, the more fiercely gods clung to this belief, the more brittle their authority became. Their actions grew reactionary, their punishments disproportionate, their interventions reckless. Mortals noticed the inconsistency even if they could not articulate its cause. Faith persisted, but trust began to erode in subtle ways, through secret cults, forbidden research, and whispered speculation among arcanists and scholars. The lie had achieved dominance, but not stability. The tablets of fate, untouched and unchallenged, continued to record obligations that gods increasingly violated in spirit, if not in letter. Each violation did not trigger immediate catastrophe. Instead, it accumulated tension. Balance does not snap suddenly, it bends, and when it finally breaks, it does so along the weakest point. By this stage of Faerun's history, that point was no longer mortal ignorance. It was divine certainty. The moment Jurgil relinquished his portfolios should have rewritten divine history. Instead, it was absorbed, reframed, and quietly neutralized. In canon, this transfer of death, murder, and the dead to Bane, Pal, and Mirkul is presented as the rise of the Dead Three, an origin steeped in ambition and cruelty. What is less emphasized is the mechanism itself. Authority moved because the system allowed it to move. That permission did not come from conquest alone. Jurgil did not fall. He chose. And the tablets of fate accepted the choice without resistance. This detail matters because it exposes the lie at its most vulnerable point. If godhood were an inherent, unassailable state, abdication would be incoherent. Yet it occurred, cleanly and without cosmic backlash. The world continued. Death continued. The portfolios functioned. Order adjusted. Among the gods, this realization landed like a wound that could not be shown. Publicly, the event was mythologized as a grim tale of three ambitious mortals rising through violence and cunning. Privately, it demonstrated that divine permanence was a story gods told themselves. Jurgil's continued existence, as a diminished power, a seneschal, a recorder, made the implication impossible to erase. He had not ceased to be. He had stepped aside. That distinction haunted the pantheons. Fear followed understanding. If one god could relinquish eternity, another could lose it unwillingly. The lie now required active maintenance. Ascension myths were narrowed. The criteria for godhood were made opaque. Mortal apotheosis became rare, dangerous, and tightly controlled. Canon does not deny ascension outright. Indeed, it records several cases, but it shows a clear pattern. The process became politicized. Permission mattered more than merit. The Dead Three themselves became cautionary figures. They were not simply new gods. They were reminders that the system could be navigated. Their eventual instability, constant rivalry, eventual downfall, and fragmentation was not accidental. It served a narrative purpose. Their failures were emphasized to discourage imitation. Their cruelty was highlighted to frame ascension as inherently corrupting, rather than structurally permissible. This reframing protected the lie. Within mortal scholarship, especially among early necromancers and arcanists, fragments of the truth persisted. Records show recurring attempts to understand the mechanics of divinity, not to worship, but to analyze. These efforts were met with disproportionate divine response. Spells were limited, knowledge suppressed. Entire schools of thought were erased, not because they were false, but because they were too accurate. Gods who once tolerated inquiry no longer did. The distinction between stewardship and sovereignty had become existential. To admit the former would be to invite evaluation. To invite evaluation would be to risk replacement. The lie had transformed from convenience into necessity. Gods now depended on it not only for worship, but for psychological survival. This dependency distorted divine justice. Punishments once tied to balance became expressions of dominance. Mercy became conditional. Intervention became theatrical. The goal was no longer correction, but deterrence, making examples of those who came too close to the truth. Canon accounts of divine wrath during this era often read as excessive because they were. They were designed to end questions, not answer them. Jurgil's silence is telling. As seneschal to later gods of death, he recorded outcomes without commentary. He did not preach the truth he embodied. He did not correct the myth. Whether this was resignation, complicity, or obedience to a higher order is debated among scholars of the realms. Canon allows for all three interpretations. What is certain is that his existence remained an unresolved contradiction the gods preferred to ignore. The lie endured, but it had changed. It was no longer merely a misunderstanding among mortals. It had become a defensive architecture within the divine order itself. Every new god inherited it. Every old god relied on it. The tablets of fate, indifferent and exact, continued to accept transfers, record duties, and enforce limits without commentary. The system still worked, but it was now being used by beings who no longer remembered why it had been built that way in the first place. The rise of Netheril exposed the lie in a way no divine abdication ever could, because this time the challenge came from mortals who understood structure. Netherese arcanists did not worship blindly. They studied. They catalogued patterns in magic, divine intervention, and limitation. In doing so, they came closer than any civilization before them to grasping what the gods themselves preferred to obscure. Magic was not owned by Mystra. It flowed through her. Canon is explicit on this point, though it is often softened in retelling. Mystra governed the weave, but she did not originate it. The weave existed as a stabilizing interface between raw magic and reality. Mystra's role was custodial, not creative. Netherese arcanists discovered this distinction through practice, not doctrine. Their spells functioned not because they pleased the goddess, but because they obeyed the deeper rules she enforced. This realization was dangerous. As Netheril ascended, literally with cities lifted into the sky, the lie began to strain. Mortals wielded power that rivaled divine miracles. They reshaped landscapes. They extended life. They ignored limits long assumed absolute. From the divine perspective, this was framed as hubris. From a structural perspective, it was competence approaching forbidden thresholds. The gods responded inconsistently. Some attempted guidance. Others issued warnings. Still others moved directly to punishment. What they did not do was clarify the truth. They did not explain that divine authority was conditional, that limits existed for stability rather than supremacy. To do so would have validated Netherese inquiry. Instead, the gods leaned harder into the fiction of inherent rule. Karsus embodied the collision. His folly is remembered as arrogance made manifest, a mortal daring to seize godhood itself. Canon records the event with clarity. Karsus cast a spell that temporarily stripped Mystra of her divinity. Magic collapsed. The weave unraveled. Netheril fell. What is often overlooked is what this act proved before it failed. Godhood could be interrupted. Karsus did not destroy Mystra through brute force or worship. He exploited structure. He targeted the mechanism, not the myth. For a brief moment, the lie failed completely. If divinity were inherent, it could not be stolen. If authority were absolute, it could not be displaced. Yet it was. The catastrophe that followed was not punishment for questioning gods. It was the natural consequence of violating balance without understanding the cost. Karsus did not fail because he was unworthy. He failed because the system he interfered with was larger than any single will, mortal or divine. Io did not intervene to save Mystra's pride. He intervened to preserve reality. This distinction matters. The fall of Netheril became the gods' strongest justification for the lie. It was retold endlessly as proof that mortals must never challenge divine authority. Yet the real lesson was more precise and far more uncomfortable. Power without custodial discipline is catastrophic, regardless of who wields it. After Netheril, divine control tightened. Magic was limited. Mortal ascent was further stigmatized. Knowledge of apotheosis became fragmented and dangerous. Maestra herself was reshaped, bound more strictly to her role, her failures interpreted as warnings rather than systemic stress. The gods learned the wrong lesson, but it was the lesson that preserved their narrative. Among scholars, dissent survived only in fragments. Arcane orders whispered. Forbidden texts circulated. The idea that gods were bound by higher law never vanished completely, but it was driven underground. The price of understanding became extinction, exile, or divine reprisal. The lie had proven its utility. It could justify annihilation while presenting itself as protection. The tablets of fate, unchanged, recorded the aftermath. They did not condemn Karsus. They did not vindicate the gods. They simply reflected what had occurred. A violation of balance, followed by correction. The system held, reality endured, and the gods, shaken but intact, returned to their roles with renewed determination to never let the truth surface so clearly again. Netheril did not fall because mortals reached too high. It fell because the lie could not survive exposure without breaking something else in its place. By the time of troubles, the lie no longer functioned quietly. It had to be enforced. Centuries of accumulated distortion, of gods acting as sovereigns rather than stewards, had produced instability that could no longer be corrected through subtle limitation. Canon records Ao's decision with stark clarity. The gods had failed their charge. This was not a war. It was an audit. When the tablets of fate were stolen, the event was framed by the gods as an act of cosmic treachery. In truth, the theft was merely the trigger. The condition already existed. The tablets had been ignored in spirit for too long. Gods had treated their roles as personal dominions, had pursued worship as entitlement rather than trust, and had allowed divine conflict to spill recklessly into mortal history. Io's response shattered the lie in action. The gods were cast down to Toril, stripped of much of their power, forced to exist within the same constraints as the mortals they ruled. This was not humiliation for spectacle. It was correction through perspective. For the first time in recorded history, the gods were compelled to experience limitation directly, not as an abstract rule, but as lived consequence. The effect was immediate and revealing. Gods panicked. Alliances collapsed. Divine confidence dissolved into fear. Those who had spoken most loudly of inherent supremacy proved least capable of navigating existence without it. Their vulnerability exposed what the tablets had always implied. Divinity was a function, not an essence. Without authorization, without structure, godhood faltered. Some adapted, many did not. Maestra's death during this period was not an accident of chaos, but a direct result of structural stress. Magic unraveled because its custodian failed while operating outside her assigned parameters. Ao's later restoration of the weave was not forgiveness. It was repair. He reasserted the same boundaries that had always existed, now enforced by memory rather than ignorance. Mortals witnessed what had been unthinkable. Gods bled. Gods fled. Gods begged. Temples burned not because faith vanished, but because the image of divine inevitability was broken. Even when the gods later regained their portfolios, the memory of their fall could not be erased. Something fundamental had shifted in the collective understanding of the realms. The lie was no longer plausible. After the crisis, Io rewrote the tablets of fate. This act is often misunderstood as a granting of new authority. Canon indicates the opposite. The rewriting clarified responsibilities. It narrowed acceptable behavior. It imposed stricter separation between divine action and mortal consequence. The gods were not elevated. They were constrained. Some gods accepted this correction. Others resented it, but none could deny it. The time of troubles proved beyond myth or theory that divine power was conditional and revocable. The lie that gods ruled by right collapsed under the weight of lived reality. Yet even now, it did not disappear entirely. Mortals returned to worship. Myths were softened. Stories reframed the crisis as an aberration rather than a revelation. Gods resumed their titles. Over time, memory dulled. The lie survived in a weakened form, not as certainty, but as habit. The tablets of fate endured once more, not hidden, not ignored, but rarely contemplated. And those who had walked as mortals remembered something they could never fully unlearn. They were not rulers of existence. They were permitted to serve it. In the wake of the time of troubles, the gods returned to their thrones altered, though few admitted it openly. Canon describes a restoration of order, yet beneath that surface lay a recalibration far more profound than temples or prayers acknowledged. The rewriting of the tablets of fate did not introduce a new system. It exposed the cost of misunderstanding the old one. Divine power resumed, but it moved differently. Gods found their actions more narrowly channeled. Interventions required intermediaries. Direct manifestations became rarer, riskier, more constrained. This was not punishment. It was enforcement of boundaries that had always existed, but were now unmistakable. The gods could no longer pretend that will alone shaped reality. The system would not allow it. This shift reshaped divine behavior in subtle ways. Where once gods acted boldly, even carelessly, they now maneuvered. Influence replaced command. Faith became negotiation rather than entitlement. Clergy were empowered not merely as mouthpieces, but as buffers, necessary layers between divine impulse and mortal consequence. The lie had lost its blunt force, and with it, much of its effectiveness. Some gods adapted with discipline. Others attempted circumvention. Canon records repeated attempts by deities to regain lost latitude through indirect means. Chosen champions, proxy wars, manipulated prophecies. None of these efforts violated the tablets outright, but all strained against their limits. Each attempt demonstrated the same truth from a different angle. Divine authority was operational, not absolute. Among scholars, the post-crisis era sparked renewed examination. The time of troubles left behind contradictions too visible to ignore. Mortal historians, arcanists, and theologians began to record events with less reverence and more precision. They noted patterns. Gods fell when they exceeded their scope. Balance returned when roles were respected. These observations did not form a unified doctrine, but they circulated quietly, reshaping elite understanding of the divine. The lie persisted, but it no longer convinced everyone. Even worship changed tone. Faith became less about inevitability and more about alignment. Mortals chose gods whose portfolios resonated with their values, rather than submitting to a cosmic monarchy. This subtle shift weakened the foundational claim of inherent rule. Authority based on choice is not authority by right. The gods noticed. Some responded with tolerance, embracing a more reciprocal relationship with their followers. Others doubled down, enforcing orthodoxy and suppressing dissent. These divergent responses fractured pantheons internally, creating tensions not rooted in alignment, but in philosophy. Whether gods were rulers or stewards was no longer merely a mortal question. it had become a divine one. Io remained silent throughout this era. His silence was not absence. Canon consistently portrays him as watchful, intervening only when balance itself is threatened. The fact that he did not act suggests that the system, strained though it was, remained functional. The correction had worked. The lie no longer endangered reality. It endangered only those who clung to it. The tablets of fate, now rewritten, did not erase the past. They recorded it. Every god who read them after the time of troubles did so with memory sharpened by humiliation and loss. They could no longer claim ignorance. The truth had been lived, not merely inscribed. What remained was choice, whether to govern as custodians within constraint or to pursue sovereignty in defiance of consequence. The age of innocence was gone. What replaced it was not enlightenment, but awareness. And awareness, unlike ignorance, does not forgive repetition. With awareness came debate, and with debate came fracture. In the centuries following the time of troubles, scholars of the realms began to articulate what had long been sensed, but rarely spoken. The gods of Faerûn were not singular in motive, nor unified in belief about their own nature. Canon does not present a single divine philosophy, because none exists. Instead, it reveals a spectrum of interpretations shaped by memory, pride, fear, and adaptation. Some gods internalized the correction. These deities treated their portfolios with renewed restraint, acting less as monarchs and more as maintainers of balance. Their interventions became precise. Their dogma emphasized responsibility over entitlement. Worship of such gods often grew quieter but deeper, rooted not in fear of punishment, but in shared purpose. Canon clerical traditions tied to these deities reflect this shift in tone. Others rejected the implication entirely. For them, the time of troubles was an anomaly, an insult rather than a lesson. These gods framed their fall as injustice, their humiliation as overreach by Ao, rather than consequence of their own distortion. They returned to power resentful, determined to reassert dominance by indirect means. Their faiths hardened. Their commands became absolute. Their tolerance for deviation vanished. This divergence explains much of later divine conflict. Wars among gods were no longer simply about alignment or ancient grudges. They became struggles over interpretation. Was a god a ruler owed obedience, or a force bound to function? Each act of divine aggression, each mortal crusade, carried this unresolved question beneath its surface. Canon histories often record outcomes without naming the cause, but the pattern is consistent. Mortal theologians noticed. Across Faerun, competing doctrines emerged within the same faiths. Some sects emphasized covenant, mutual obligation between God and worshipper. Others demanded submission without condition. Both claimed legitimacy. Both cited canon scripture. The contradiction was not textual. It was philosophical, rooted in the unresolved legacy of the lie. The gods did not clarify. To do so would have required acknowledging that the question itself was valid. Silence allowed ambiguity to persist, and ambiguity preserved power. Yet this silence also permitted erosion. Faith fractured, devotion diversified. The divine monopoly on meaning weakened, replaced by interpretation rather than decree. In this environment, ascension remained possible, but perilous. Canon records later cases of mortals approaching godhood through structured means, often with divine sponsorship. These ascensions were carefully managed, heavily constrained, and politically charged. The system allowed them, but the gods feared them. Each new god was proof that divinity was not closed. not fixed, not inherently theirs. The lie still existed, but it no longer defined reality. It had become a claim, asserted by some gods, doubted by others, and increasingly evaluated by mortals. The tablets of fate did not intervene in this debate. They never had. Their role was not to enforce belief, but to ensure function. As long as balance held, interpretation was permitted. That permission carried a warning. Systems tolerate distortion until distortion becomes instability. The history of Faerun shows this cycle repeating. Confidence curdling into certainty, certainty into excess, excess into correction. The first lie had survived because it adapted, but adaptation is not resolution. By this stage, the question was no longer whether the lie was false. The question was whether the gods themselves still believed it. When the full record is examined, creation myths, divine abdications, mortal ascensions, catastrophic corrections, the pattern resolves with uncomfortable clarity. The first lie written into Faerun was never carved into the tablets of fate. It was written into interpretation, a slow inversion, where stewardship was reframed as sovereignty, and responsibility was mistaken for birthright. Canon supports this conclusion without contradiction. The tablets of fate did not fail. Ao did not change his nature. The system did not collapse. Every crisis that shook the realms, Jurgel's surrender, Netheral's fall, the time of troubles, occurred not because the structure was flawed, but because its operators forgot what it was for. Each correction restored balance without rewriting the underlying truth. That truth is simple. The gods of Faerun do not rule reality. They administer it. Their power is immense, but it is scoped. Their authority is real, but it is conditional. They are bound to portfolios that pre-exist them, constrained by laws they did not create, and answerable to an order that does not require their worship to endure. When they act within those bounds, the realms prosper. When they exceed them, reality responds. The lie mattered because belief shaped behavior. As long as gods believed themselves sovereign, they acted as monarchs, defensive, possessive, punitive. Mortals suffered not because balance demanded it, but because authority felt threatened. The greatest tragedies of Faerun are not accidents of chaos. They are consequences of misremembered duty. Yet the record also shows restraint. Not all gods embraced the lie equally. Some adapted, some learned, some governed quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Their continued stability is not coincidence. It is alignment with purpose. Canon does not reward arrogance. It tolerates it, until it cannot. Io's silence at the end is instructive. He does not announce the truth. He never has. He enforces outcome, not belief. The system does not require gods to understand it. It requires them to function within it. Understanding merely reduces the cost of failure. The first lie was never exposed through revelation. It was exposed through repetition. Again and again, history demonstrates the same result. Godhood treated as ownership leads to collapse. Godhood treated as charge leads to continuity. This is not theology. It is record. The realms remember, even when their gods prefer not to. And so the truth stands uncovered, not as accusation, but as fact. Faerun was never ruled by divine right. It was maintained by divine permission. Everything else was interpretation.